Moving on to international news, we're going to cover two stories from each region that we feel are being largely underreported by the mainstream global press. The so-called civil war in Yemen, that could perhaps more accurately be called a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, had already left the country devastated, with millions of people displaced, dead, or at serious risk of starvation. Now, although testing capacity in Yemen is woefully inadequate, a growing global consensus seems to be emerging that Yemen may be not only one of the hardest hit countries in the world by COVID-19, but also one of the least well-equipped countries in the world to deal with this pandemic. With this in mind, Saudi Arabia has stepped into a leadership role and will seek to raise $2.4 billion via a virtual donor conference call, mutually backed by the UN. It's hard to know how much of this money will actually go to relief efforts and how much the infrastructure damage in Yemen will disrupt the delivery of the relief. But it is at least a positive step in the right direction, and this will be a story we will keep an eye on moving forward. Protests have been raging in Lebanon since September, mostly over a shattered economy, limited civil rights, and a failure of government services. Now, with COVID-19 added to the mix, Lebanon appears to be in the midst of its worst ever economic crisis, and the protests seem to be escalating as the overall situation in Lebanon deteriorates. It's hard to know where Lebanon goes from here. Lebanon has already seen their entire government resign, only to be replaced without an election via a series of backroom deals struck by the identical sectarian puppet masters the people were protesting against in the first place. There was a time that Beirut was one of the world's most attractive tourist destinations, and Lebanon was widely viewed as a nation on the rise. The question now becomes whether or not the Lebanese people can force the train back on the track after decades of decline. Only time will tell. Moving on to Asia, the situation in Hong Kong has been brewing for years. In 1997, China and the United Kingdom signed the historic One Country, Two Systems Agreement, which created a union between China and Hong Kong while allowing Hong Kong to continue functioning with a degree of autonomy. This arrangement was intended to last till 2047, but in 2003, massive protests broke out when mainland China tried to push reforms the residents of Hong Kong felt were intended to restrict freedom. And the Chinese government backed down. But then in 2012, Hong Kong saw mass protests again over mainland China's attempts to introduce communist propaganda into Hong Kong's primary and secondary education curriculum, and the protesters again won the day. But in 2014, the tide started to turn, as mainland China's decision to interfere in the selection of Hong Kong's chief executive caused the largest protests yet, with mainland China ultimately prevailing in putting the protests down and growing its influence in Hong Kong. And of course, we recently saw a new wave of protests break out in July as Hong Kong considered passing a new law that would allow citizens of Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China. This latest wave of protests has never stopped, as each government attempt to stop the protests has only led to new reasons to protest. As of right now, Hong Kong legislators who are loyal to Beijing are trying to push measures through that move Hong Kong away from liberty and toward authoritarianism. And now, because of mainland China's consistent interference in Hong Kong, that most feel falls well outside the 1997 agreement, President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have announced their intentions to no longer treat Hong Kong separately from China, which means revoking their special trade status and subjecting them to the same tariffs and potential sanctions that the U.S. has placed and might place on China. What isn't clear at this moment is whether this move will hurt China or the people of Hong Kong more. Suffice it to say that Hong Kong is a powder keg, and it's a powder keg that would have major global ramifications if it did in fact explode. U.S. President Donald Trump has offered to serve as an arbitrator of a border dispute between India and China that has existed with occasional flare-ups since the two countries fought a war in 1962. China predictably rejected U.S. help almost immediately, and while there's no official word from India on the matter, the Indian government rejected an offer of U.S. assistance to help settle the disagreements with Pakistan over the Kashmir region just a few months ago, so there's probably no good reason to expect the Indian government to accept American help now. This much I can tell you, the very last thing the world needs right now is a war between two nuclear powers with populations in excess of 1 billion people. Fortunately, it seems that Indian Prime Minister Modi and Chinese Premier Xi are mostly posturing and do not have legitimate interest in seeing this situation escalate further. In Africa, despite the fact that Niger's constitution clearly stipulates that secrecy of correspondence and of communications is inviolable, their parliament just passed a law allowing for wiretapping as a means to combat terrorism. This is going to be an intriguing story to watch unfold for Americans in particular, as this new law will undoubtedly remind many of the Patriot Act, a law designed to provide law enforcement with new tools to fight Islamic extremism, which was subsequently abused repeatedly to target American citizens who had nothing to do with jihadism. Civil libertarians in America were highly suspicious of the Patriot Act, and civil libertarians today in Niger are highly suspicious about this new law. So this also is one to keep an eye on. The February peace deal between longtime combatants Salva Kiir and Riek Machar that allegedly ended the devastating 6-year civil war in South Sudan appears to be unraveling. Indeed, it's possible that the deal never had much of a chance to begin with, because the actual conflict was never between just two leaders. The fact the so-called peace deal included only two ethnic groups and their leaders, while excluding all other ethnic groups and their leaders, probably doomed the deal from the word go. Now, with violence spreading just as COVID-19 begins devastating the region, not to mention a locust famine that is destroying crops in East Africa, it appears as if the unimaginable hardship in South Sudan is sadly not on a path to improve anytime soon. In Europe, Italy has seen the average new daily cases drop by 25% and the new daily deaths drop by 39% over the last 14 days. As such, the Italian government is allowing the reopening of some major tourist destinations, including the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Italy is limiting the number of people who can enter the tower at the same time, and they're requiring those who enter to wear masks. But as a country, they do appear to be moving forward with an attempt to return to normalcy, or at least as much as that's currently possible. Other nations with economies that depend heavily on tourism are going to be paying very careful attention to what happens in Italy, especially as Italy was one of the hardest hit countries in the world back in March and April. Brexit dealt a blow to unity amongst the four nations of the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. COVID-19 has clearly exacerbated these growing divisions, with Scotland and Wales desiring to ease restrictions more slowly than England. In 2014, the Scottish people voted to stay in the UK, but this global pandemic has people in both Scotland and Wales renewing calls for independence referendums. Both sides of the debates and the non-English members of the UK have valid points. On one hand, English politicians operating out of London do at times tend to think they have the right to dominate the other three UK countries. And nearly all people, of course, long for equality and freedom. On the other hand, the English economy is by far larger than the other three countries, and a formal break away from the UK would mean the end of vital financial support from the English. I don't think anyone can know for sure what to expect, but we do know that COVID-19 and the accompanying stress to both finances and mental health certainly aren't helping matters in this situation. Taking a look at the Pacific Rim now, months after the worst of the Australian fires died down, many residents of the devastated areas report the promised and heavily publicized help simply never arrived. The government created a $1.3 billion relief fund to help affected people, and hundreds of millions of additional dollars came pouring in from the international community. Yet, this relief money in many cases doesn't seem to be reaching the people who need the most help, with the application processes being laborious and the wait times to receive answers about an application status often stretching beyond 10 weeks. Clearly, like has happened with nearly all crises that predated COVID-19, the Australian bushfire response has taken a backseat to their COVID-19 response. It isn't easy for a government that was already overextended to be able to effectively manage dual crises simultaneously that both feature far-ranging negative effects. The Philippine government is set to pass perhaps the most comprehensive consumer protection package in the nation's history. The new measure aims to improve transparency, prevent price gouging, prevent discrimination, and also protect privacy, while additionally invalidating contracts that prevent consumers from taking appropriate recourse actions against predatory practices. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has earned a reputation on the topic of human rights abuses and also on the topic of reforms designed to help the common people. He isn't the first authoritarian leader to blend dictatorial tendencies with benevolent policies, but most authoritarians tend to become more dictatorial and less benevolent over time, so it will be fascinating to watch how the Duterte regime continues to play out. Now taking a look at Latin and South America, in Suriname it looks like the reign of former military dictator and current elected president, Desi Bouterse, may be over, if he agrees to peacefully follow the will of the people, who just voted the opposition party into power. One major issue to keep an eye on here is that Bouterse has already been convicted of murdering political opponents in the 80s, which means that stepping down from power would mean stepping into a prison cell. The people of Suriname deserve a peaceful transition of power, but Bouterse is not a peaceful man. We intend to continue following this developing story closely. In Peru, which is Latin America's second hardest hit country by the global pandemic, the hospitals are currently failing. 1,300 doctors so far have been infected, and frontline medical professionals have been demanding additional government resources be made available. The problem, of course, is that the Peruvian government has limited resources to begin with, and creating additional currency would weaken the currency's value, and inflation tends to hit the poorest people the soonest and the hardest. Sadly, this global pandemic is a situation with zero easy questions and zero right answers.